So this week, chapter 12 in your text, Happiness. I highly recommend you read it, but I also highly recommend that you spend at least as much time with this presentation and answering some questions. I have throughout this presentation several questions that I actually do want you to answer. So open up a document, get ready to answer them. And as we go through some of the things that I say and ask, and also some of the TED Talks that I'm going to have you watch, I'm going to guide your listening and focus so that you have some questions that you will answer based on those things. So, happiness. This is one of my favorite weeks of the semester, and I so wish I could be with you so that we could have a conversation around it. Happiness ultimately is one of those things that we're all striving for in some way, and we might want to achieve it through success or through making enough money or having a family or having the right relationship or maybe all of those things. Or maybe we just want to live a life alone with books and we just want to write and create things. Whatever it is that seems to be your happiness, this has been a subject of thought since human beings have been around. And since they've been able to write, we have ideas from the ages all the way up until now about how to be happy, how to sort of maximize the happiness that we can enjoy in our lives. So that's what this week is about. This part of the week is about. I will also be focusing on religion in the second half of the week. But even in the second folder, in the second module, part 2, I will have a happiness exercise relating to the projects that you turned in. So let's move along, and I'll start with a couple of simple questions. What makes a person happy? This is the age-old question, and we will look at, as I said, some age-old advice from the thinkers of ancient Greece, all the way up until the most recent studies from our scientists and psychologists. The questions that they ask and have always asked is, does happiness come from outside, or is it something inside, or is it something of both? Now, maybe the first question you would answer, for an external source to say, well, I would be happy having enough money, so I didn't have to worry. And actually, that would be a great answer if that's what you were thinking. Let's start there, first of all. This is one of the things that occupies the minds of so many. Going to school to get a decent job so you can make money, partly to be useful in society. Maybe you want to be more of a person who makes just a little bit of money but does a lot of good for other people, or maybe you want to be like a business person or someone in a technical job, or maybe as a doctor or a nurse or an engineer, and maybe making a lot of money. And it is that security maybe that will give you a sense of happiness. Well, this has been studied, and to a certain point, it is true that if you don't have enough money, it is more likely that you'll be unhappy. And what this chart is that you see here is that there's a certain leveling out that happens after around a salary of about $60,000 a year, and that's probably like per person. Maybe for a family that's going to be a little bit bigger, but essentially there is a flattening off of the curve. At a certain point, once you make enough money, your happiness level really isn't going to increase. There'll be other things you can do, maybe with more money. You can have bigger houses, bigger cars, but it doesn't necessarily make you more happy according to the people who have that much money. So if you want to find out more about this particular study, and there are many actually, you can look up Daniel Kahneman's TED Talk. I just put the link there for you. But I've got others that I really want you to watch. This was just a brief look at one of the external sources of happiness that people seek and maybe spend too much time working toward, when actually there's only so much that money can do for you. All right. Now, I'm being a little scattershot in the beginning of this presentation only because this is something that came up just in the last couple of weeks, and I heard it. I knew I had to share it with you, and that is that you have a superpower. During the pandemic, there are a lot of people who were already, let's say, fragile, or who were sensitive to being lonely more so than others. And so, as you probably have heard, there have been a lot of people who are very depressed and getting worse. A lot of people overdosing on drugs, people committing suicide. That has markedly increased during this pandemic. And so I was listening to the radio, and I've been looking for the source. I will keep looking, and if I find it, I'll share it with you. But until I do, I'll just share what I remember the conversation. But the psychologist got on, and someone, had asked her, what do we tell our kids about living through this pandemic? I know they're experiencing it very differently than I am, and they seem to be, in this particular case, this person was asking her, they seem to be, really getting bummed out about this. They can't see their friends as much as they want to. They're not having a normal college experience, a normal high school experience. And her comment was to tell young people not to forget that you have a superpower, which older adults do not. And she explained it as, and we all remember this, all of us who are adults and lived through this, that you feel things way more intensely than you will when you are, in your 30s and later. Your teen years, early 20s, your emotions are far sharper, more overwhelming even sometimes. And so you can use that to your advantage. When you are feeling the stress of being isolated or getting overwhelmed with work or with schoolwork, you can use this to your advantage by doing something that you really, really enjoy. And it takes your mind into a completely different track. You will experience maybe it's watching your favorite movie, and it just makes you feel so much happier, maybe so much more emotional relief once you're done. It's sort of cathartic. Well, then use that. So that was her advice, is to remind young people that you have a superpower. You feel things more intensely, so use it. When you're feeling something intensely that's negative, go to your favorite thing and do that. All right, so there's a little bit of advice from from an anonymous psychologist. I'll figure out who that is, and I will share it with you. But honestly, I can't find it yet. And NPR is making me angry because I can't just search for things and find them easily. Okay, enough of that. So now for our regularly scheduled program. I have a few TED Talks that I want you to watch, so it's going to take some time. So I will try and talk briefly on each of these slides. The first one is by Dan Gilbert, and he addresses this very question. What is it that makes us happy? And he's a scientist, so he studies the mind. And in particular, he focuses on happiness, and he has some very interesting information. So I want you to stop this presentation and go to what makes us happy. You will have about, I think it's 15 minutes or so to watch, and I have two questions for you to think about while he is talking, and then you might need to stop that, answer the questions, and then continue on, which is, what is synthesized happiness? Is it of any use to us? And then secondly, describe the two experiments that Dan Gilbert uses to prove his case. So I will see you in a moment. So welcome back. So there are a few things in the text that I want to highlight, and this is the thinking from ages past, and we're going to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks and what they were thinking about in terms of happiness. What makes for a happy life? And first of all, from the Greeks, we get the idea of hedonism. Hedonism is, and I'm just reading this slide, is a way of living life in that you seek every moment of pleasure that you can, especially physical pleasures, eating, drinking, using drugs, and having sex. So my third question for you is, why would people live this way, do you suppose? Based on your reading and based on just this simple idea of you've had life experience, you've enjoyed eating before, maybe some of you have enjoyed some drinking, hopefully you're avoiding drugs, but why do you suppose people seek these things? Right. Now, physical pleasure obviously is something that we all would like, and we certainly want to avoid unpleasurable things, things that are painful or things that make us feel sick. But when we seek pleasures, is there a point at which we should seek no further, that it can actually do us harm? Well, these are the questions that the ancient Greeks thought about. It helps to have an image to keep in your mind. So if you can find something in this picture that will make you think of hedonism, the name, like maybe it's a hot summer day, and so you're thinking hedonism or something. I don't know. But think of a way to use this picture to remember hedonism. It's about this kind of a life of just enjoying pleasures. So Aristippus, ancient Greek philosopher, he formulated this theory of happiness, that one must enjoy every possible moment of pleasure. Otherwise, if you're not enjoying something, you're not enjoying yourself, then this is time wasted. And he's talking about physical pleasures, the ones that I listed before. And these are echoed through even our poets and our thinkers and writers of later times. Shakespeare, for example, Eat, Drink, and Be Merry. Herrick, who writes, or this is Robert Herrick, the poet, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, because you don't know what tomorrow may bring. The Latin phrase, carpe diem, seize the day. If you haven't watched Dead Poets Society before, it's a great movie, really enjoyable. It's sad. So bring the Kleenex. But seizing the day is about not knowing what tomorrow brings, and so hedonism is about enjoying every moment while you can. There's a certain gift to living in the moment, isn't there? And you hear that as good advice. And we'll return to this theme as we go. There are different ways of doing that. One of the terms that is in your text that students have some trouble with sometimes is big earnings theory. This comes from hedonism, which is that every time I have to do something unpleasant, a chore, whatever, a service rendered for someone where I'm not really getting anything out of it, I deserve some sort of a pleasure as a return. So big earnings theory isn't about, you should be able to make as much money as you want, or if you work really hard, you make a lot of money. It's not that. It's about if you do something for someone that you expect a return. All right. So for example, a child is in school, and so he's having trouble getting good grades, or she just has real trouble buckling down with homework. And so their parents say, well, if you do really well this semester, I'm going to pay you, $5 for every A you got. That is big earnings theory. You're asking the child to do something very unpleasant for their parents so that they will get pay in the end. And of course, they don't realize that this is for their own good, but it's something unpleasant. There's a reward for doing something unpleasant. So big earnings theory. And then my fourth question for you to answer is, do people who live in service, or even like in meditation, there are monks and nuns, people in holy places who spend most of their time or a lot of their time just praying, do they enjoy some sort of happiness also? That doesn't seem very hedonistic. So this is a question that I want you to think about and then answer. It doesn't have to be a long answer. Epicurus, another Greek philosopher, also thinking about happiness, took Aristippus's ideas, but then refined them a bit. He said, well, okay, yes, we want to enjoy as much pleasure as possible in order to be happy. But there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So yeah, I like to eat, but if I eat too much, well, then I get fat, and then my legs hurt, or if I drink too much, over time I lose my mental faculties. So too much of a good thing, that's not a good thing anymore. Where's the line? And so his idea was that one should live moderately and avoid pain. And that way you will be happier, rather than to seek simply after every physical pleasure that comes along. Too much of a good thing, as I mentioned, leads to pain. So for Epicurus, the idea is to structure your life in such a way as to avoid pain, the pain of loss, for example, by not acquiring what can be lost. What does that mean? Well, getting stuff, buying stuff, having relationships. He even meant that if you seek for a loving relationship, that is something that can be lost and would be terribly painful, and so you shouldn't seek it. So there you go. There's a formula for happiness, don't you think? So Epicureans enjoy the arts, study, things of the mind, things that cannot be lost, except of course they can by old age. But the idea was that once you learn to do something, once you learn to appreciate something, your inner life cannot be lost to you. So stop seeking things that are external. In other words, for your source of happiness. Some questions for you then to think about. What measures do you take to avoid pain? Now think about the things that you do during the course of a day or a couple of days or a week. What is it that you do to avoid unpleasantness, to avoid pain? And I don't mean physical pain necessarily, but other kinds of pain, loss in your life, or things that you do to avoid discomfort. 6, do you plan for contingencies? And by that I mean if X happens, then I know I can do Y. I'm prepared. All right, so do you plan ahead for things that could go wrong? When you plan for a vacation, do you have alternative plans just in case this museum is closed, we'll do this, or just in case this amusement park is too crowded, well, we can do this other thing. Do you carry extra money with you? That sort of thing. 7, is buying insurance a hedonistic practice? Think about that. Why or why not? So the why or why not is really what I'm after. Give it a thought. Is that hedonistic? Our society has some hedonistic practices like to avoid pain, like for example, hint hint, we have insurance available. We also have public insurance, for example, for those that are in need of welfare or unemployment benefits. We also have Medicare and for the elderly, and Medicaid for children who are in poverty. So we do have some kinds of insurance as sort of a social safety net, so that people who are the most vulnerable can avoid discomfort in their lives. We also, as a society and around the world, have safety measures of various kinds. In our cars, we have safety belts. There's a lot of safety built into the mechanics of a car. If you work in a factory, or really just about anywhere where there's any machinery, or even a restaurant, there are certain safety measures, precautions, and regulations about how your work environment needs to be safe, both for you and also for your customers. We have vaccines. This is something that obviously is designed to prevent disease. And warning labels, another random example. You find warning labels even in the most ridiculous things, because behind every warning label there is someone who sued someone else because they did probably something silly often. And so that produced a warning label so that that company can't be sued again for whatever it was that happened. So you'll see that on the top step of a ladder is do not step here. No one in their right mind would do it because you can feel how wobbly it is, but somebody did it. Somebody wasn't in their right mind. And so we have warning labels. Those are things that our society does to help avoid discomfort and pain and death. R.D. Laing was a famous psychiatrist, and in all of his years of dealing with patients who were unhappy, he says pain in this life is not avoidable, but the pain we create avoiding pain is avoidable. What does he mean by that? For example, that could be people who stay in bad relationships too long and they are trying to avoid the pain of splitting up, but actually that pain that they're avoiding is causing them more pain. Some of the pain we create by avoiding pain is avoidable by taking substances to help us forget the pain that we have, and thereby creating even more pain. So I think he probably is hinting at some of those things. Stoicism is also an old idea going back to the Greeks, and the Buddhists would probably agree with this idea or many of their ideas. This comes initially and originally from Zeno, the Greek philosopher, but Plato and Aristotle also followed in his thinking. One of the most important ideas is that pain and suffering is unavoidable. So unlike the previous hedonists who said that you should spend your life trying to avoid pain, they said, well, yeah, pain and suffering that comes from external sources so often or is something that is beyond our control. And so what do you do about it? Well, the best thing is to endure it and accept that all things will pass. So that is finding happiness within, really. It's looking inside for an inner strength that says, I can accept what's happening now. Or maybe I don't accept it, but I know it's happening now. It's not going to last forever. And so I'll just endure it until it passes. Otherwise, I'm going to increase my suffering. That is exactly what they said, is that unhappiness results from our response to the world, in particular to negative things, and that if we fight things that we cannot change, we make ourselves feel worse. So, as I said, to find happiness, we must look inward. And so the next question I would have you answer on your document is, who could you think of that suffers in some way and yet seems to be happy? I'm looking for real figures in the world or from history, someone who seems to be suffering, who is in maybe dire circumstances or unpleasant circumstances, and yet they're happy. If you like wandering around in the minds of philosophers and toying with their ideas, here's one from Aristotle. He suggests that happiness is in living life well, in the grand scheme of things, not in moment-to-moment pleasures. And like the Stoics, he agrees that a life of reason and virtue is the goal. These are things that you develop, you train your mind to. A pleasure in the moment can always be lessened or ruined by the thought of greater pleasures. This is his reasoning. And so these pleasures cannot be the goal. That is, if you gain some pleasure of some kind, you buy something, the next car or the next boat, there's always a better motto, a better brand, and he says it is the thought of these things that will inevitably make those pleasures fade. And so they cannot really be the goal because it's endless. And so ideally then, and so presumably then, you would never really be happy if that's what you seek. Right? So here's a great little boat. I would love to have something like this. I live near Lake Michigan. It would be fun to be able to explore with something like that. I would be perfectly happy with that. I think probably a lot of people would, unless someone goes by with this boat. Well, gee, you could get more people in there. You could have a nice time with a bunch of friends. Oh, maybe that would be nicer. You see where this is going. There's always something better. Something bigger. Yes, the people who make luxury items know about this truth of the human condition. They make really big boats. If having a big boat isn't enough, get a bigger boat that has a big boat on the side of it and a helicopter on the top. Right? So clearly there's no end to this. You can have as big a boat as you could ever want, and still there would be something better for you to buy if you had the money for it. Buddhism has a very simple idea at its core, which is that happiness is found in being free from desire, being free from wanting stuff, things that you don't have. This is a similar philosophy to Stoic acceptance, right? And the virtue that Aristotle promoted. Buddhism spells this out in more detail, and there are two paths to happiness. One is the Hinayana, and the other is the Mahayana. The Hinayana is the narrow path that you see the Buddhist monks following, which is a good life through meditation and following what they call the Eightfold Path, which is 8 steps to this ultimate sense of happiness. And these Four Noble Truths will sound familiar. Life is filled with pain. The cause of pain is frustrated desire. That could be even the desire for the pain to go away, or for circumstances to be different than they are, or for someone else to be different than they are. There is a way out of this pain, and that is the Eightfold Path, which is described in your book if you'd like to read it detail by detail. But essentially, it is to remove from yourself desire for things that you don't have and to be happy. The Mahayana is the broader way. You don't have to be a monk in order to do this. And this is how most people in Asia who describe themselves as Buddhists live, which is they work, they have children, they have families, they do have some things, but they find their happiness in living with as little desire as possible, and by helping others to live the same way. So leaping, a couple of thousand years closer to us, in the 1800s, Freud was a thinker on the human condition as a founder of psychoanalysis, which is the method of exploring a person's sources of unhappiness or mental disease by looking at the past, looking at their childhood, investigating their dreams, using hypnotherapy to try and talk to the unconscious, let it express itself. His idea about unhappiness was that it was caused by mental illness, and that mental illness is rooted in childhood. As I said, dreams give insight to the subconscious mind. His idea, too, was that most of this is caused by sexual repression. He came from a German society. I think he was Austrian, actually, but that society was, sexually speaking, very closed-mouthed. If you lived in the cities, I think this was true, more in the cosmopolitan society, this would have been true. My mother is German. She came from Munich, lived through, as a child, lived through World War II. She grew up with the same closed-mouthedness about sex. It was something that just wasn't talked about. And so she met my father while he was stationed in Germany in the 1950s, and they fell in love. They got married. He brought her over to the United States. Lots of interesting stories there. And when she was about maybe 8 or 9 months into marriage, my grandmother noticed that she was, my mother was feeling ill, and she started asking her some questions, and it's like, well, when's the last time you had your period? And my mother said, oh, well, I really don't remember. And my grandmother, my grandma was a farm woman. She lived through the Depression, raised 10 children. She, out with the cows, and she was a woman of the earth. That she knew what life was about. My mother had no clue, and she said, my grandmother says, you're pregnant. You're going to have a child. And my mother was a little confused at first. She really actually did not know how that happened. The only advice that she got from her mother, my other grandmother, was that there are certain things that a man is allowed to do in marriage, and you just let it happen. And she didn't explain anything else to her. It's just nuts, completely nuts. And this is what Freud, I believe, was rebelling against, was this German sexual repression in society, especially in more cosmopolitan society. Farmers, people that live in the mountains, people that live more simply. They're closer to the earth. They're earthier, literally. They understand these things. But in German society, it was not so. And so he saw this as a tremendous burden on the society, and that it was causing all kinds of mental illness in the people that he saw. So that's where that comes from. That was just kind of a long, I guess, explanation of what that line means. But I believe I understand what it is he was talking about. So for him, the pursuit of happiness is doomed. There's just no way to try to be happy. You are or you aren't. You just simply avoid unhappiness. And if happiness comes along, well, lucky for you. But you can't make someone happy. And so he saw this all on a spectrum, on a single line. At one end of the line, you were unhappy, and at the other end, you were happy. And for him, you could try and move someone toward the middle, but that was about it. So Freud affected the course of the study of mental illness and the treatment of mental illness for 100+ years. Since no, I don't want to put a date on it, but over the last several decades, let's say, psychologists and psychiatrists and researchers have been studying this much more closely and rethinking what Freud has said. And you will hear from Nancy Etkoff in the next slide. I'll have a link to her talk, that she said that spectrum that Freud described of having unhappiness at one end and happiness in the other really wasn't true, that there were two spectrums at work. And one was the unhappiness spectrum, where you tried to bring someone out of depression, for example, if there was an illness, out of that, and then also to show them ways to be happy as well. And she approaches this as a scientist, and so I'll let you get to that in the next slide. So I'll let you get straight to this TED Talk and listen to what she has to say. She's a researcher, and she's using some technical terms, but in general, she tries to speak to a layman you don't have to have scientific experience to understand everything she's talking about. And then I have a question for you. What does she study that gives her an understanding of happiness? The next TED Talk I want you to listen to is by Robert Waldinger, and this is one of my favorites. Studies that are one of the reasons is that studies that come out very often are not anything like this one. This is a longitudinal study. 75 years they've been studying subjects. Normally a study will look at just a slice of a moment of time, and everybody that eats bread, how healthy are they? Something like that. And so they ask people how much bread they eat, and then they look at how healthy they are at the moment. And maybe that might even extend out a year or two or so. But those are very short studies. These long-term studies are rare, partly because they're so difficult to run continuously, and they don't always ask the most profound questions, and so sometimes people just sort of lose interest. But this one's very interesting. So there are three questions that follow with this one. What institution did this study? Who did they study? And then, what is the single most important factor in long-term physical and mental health, as well as longevity, that Robert Waldinger is telling us this study has discovered? Finally, last one. One more talk, one more TED Talk on happiness. This is Emily Esfahani Smith. She comes from an Iranian family, and her argument is, after all this that we've said, is that there's more to life than simply trying to be happy. And she has some interesting ideas on this. And I have just one question for you. What are Emily Esfahani Smith's 4 pillars?